For 11 years, I believed my marriage to Daniel was the kind of marriage other people envied quietly at family barbecues. I believed my best friend Whitney, a woman I had known since we were 19 years old sharing a two-bedroom apartment with a broken radiator, would rather cut off her own hand than hurt me. I believed my mother, Linda, a woman who used to tell me that family protects family no matter what, meant those words the way I understood them. I was wrong about all three of them, and the person who finally showed me the truth wasn't a stranger, and it wasn't some anonymous message online. It was my older brother, Marcus, the quietest man in our entire family, the one who never started drama, never repeated gossip, and never once in 36 years of being my brother had given me a single reason to doubt him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Marcus found didn't come from snooping through phones or hiring some private investigator like you see in movies. It came from something far simpler and far more painful because of how ordinary it was. A missed call that lit up a phone screen at 1 in the morning while Daniel claimed to be asleep beside me. A photograph buried in an old family album, 2 women laughing on a beach trip that was supposed to be just the two of them, except my brother recognized the hotel balcony in the background from a work trip Daniel had taken that same week. A group text between me, my mother, and my sister-in-law that used to buzz constantly with recipes and birthday reminders, and then, without explanation, went completely silent for 11 days right around the same time Whitney stopped returning my calls. By the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly why I have not spoken one single word to my own mother in 14 months. You will understand why, out of every person I once called family, my brother Marcus is the only one I trust completely with my life, my son, and every secret I have left. And you will understand why, when my mother finally said the words that ended our relationship for good, I did not scream, I did not cry in front of her, I simply stood up, walked out of her kitchen, and never went back. What she said to me that afternoon is something I have replayed in my head almost every single day since, and once you hear it, I think you will understand exactly why I could never look at her the same way again. This is the story of how I lost a husband, a best friend, and a mother, all within the same 6 months, and how the only person left standing beside me was the one relative nobody in our family ever paid much attention to. To understand how a marriage, a friendship, and a mother-daughter relationship could all collapse within the same 6 months, you first need to understand the 4 people at the center of this story, because none of them started out as villains, not even the ones who ended up breaking me the most. There was Daniel, my husband of 11 years, a man everyone in my life described as steady, dependable, the kind of man your father shakes hands with twice because he approves that much. There was Whitney, closer to me than any sister could have been, present for every major moment of my adult life, from the day I got married to the day I brought my son home from the hospital. And there was Marcus, my older brother, a man of very few words, who noticed things long before he ever said anything about them. And then there was my mother, Linda, the woman who raised me to believe that family always comes first, that blood protects blood, that no matter what happens outside those walls, home is the one place you are never abandoned. I believed her completely. I built my entire understanding of loyalty around those words, which is exactly why, when everything finally came apart, her reaction broke something in me that I am still not sure has fully healed. Even now, 14 months later, as I sit here telling you this story from a kitchen table that no longer has her sitting across from me. There are 3 questions I want you to hold on to as this story unfolds, because each answer arrives later than you expect, and each one changes how you see the people involved. First, exactly how long was Daniel and Whitney's affair really going on, and how many people around me already knew before I did? Second, why would a mother, my own mother, choose to defend a son-in-law over the daughter she carried, raised, and swore would always come first? And third, what exactly did my mother say to me, in her own kitchen, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that was so damaging, so final, that it ended our relationship completely, with no path back to repair? This is not simply a story about a husband who cheated with a best friend, because unfortunately, stories like that happen every single day, all across this country, and most of them do not need 14 minutes of your time, let alone an hour. This is a story about who actually shows up to protect you when everything falls apart, and who has quietly been protecting someone else this entire time, right in front of you, while calling it love. Whitney came into my life even earlier than Daniel did, back when we were 19 years old sharing a cramped two-bedroom apartment with a landlord who never fixed the heat. She was there the night I got engaged, screaming louder than anyone else in the room. She stood beside me at my wedding, in a dress she picked out herself, because she said she wanted it to match the flowers exactly. When my son was born, she was the second person allowed in the hospital room, right after Daniel, and I gave her the honor of being his godmother, because in my mind, there was no one on this earth more trustworthy with my child than her. We spoke almost every single day. I told her things I never told my own mother. Looking back now, I understand that closeness was never something I should have taken for granted, but at the time, it felt like the safest relationship I had outside my marriage. My brother Marcus is 5 years older than me, and if you asked anyone in our family to describe him in one word, almost every single person would say the same thing: quiet. Marcus never gossiped, never inserted himself into other people's business, and rarely offered an opinion unless you directly asked him for one. He showed up to every holiday, every birthday, every small family gathering, said very little, helped clean up without being asked, and went home. Some people in our family used to joke that Marcus noticed everything and said nothing, and for most of my life, I assumed that meant he simply did not care enough to speak up. I could not have been more wrong about him, and it is exactly that quiet, careful nature that made what he eventually did for me so much harder, and so much more important, than anything anyone else in our family was willing to do. And then there is my mother, Linda, the woman who shaped almost everything I believe about what family is supposed to mean. She raised my brother and me mostly on her own for several years before my father fully committed to being present, and she often reminded us, especially during hard times, that family sticks together no matter what, that blood does not turn its back on blood. I trusted that completely. I built my sense of safety in this world around the belief that no matter what happened to my marriage, my friendships, or my career, my mother would always be the one person firmly on my side. Looking back now, there was one earlier moment I brushed past without much thought, a time years before any of this happened, when my mother chose to protect a family friend's reputation over the truth, and quietly asked the rest of us to do the same. At the time, I told myself that was simply her being a peacemaker. I did not yet understand that peacemaking, in her hands, often meant deciding in advance whose comfort mattered more. Looking back on those years now, there were small details I noticed but never thought to question. Daniel's phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter for anyone to see, started disappearing into his pocket more often. Whitney began mentioning trips and plans in a slightly different way, vague on dates, vague on who exactly was joining her. None of it seemed significant enough on its own to raise an alarm, and honestly, I do not think I would have noticed any of it at all if my brother had not started paying closer attention. Marcus never said a word to me about his suspicions in those early months. He simply watched, quietly, the way he always did, gathering small pieces that did not yet form a full picture. What he eventually discovered, and the moment he finally decided he could not stay silent any longer, is where this story truly begins to turn. It started, as Marcus later told me, with something almost too small to mention. We were at our parents' house for a Sunday dinner, nothing unusual about the day at all, when he noticed Daniel's phone buzz twice on the counter, and instead of glancing at it the way most people do out of casual curiosity, Daniel picked it up, turned slightly away from the room, and typed a response with his thumb angled to block the screen. On its own, that meant nothing. People protect their privacy for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with betrayal. But Marcus noticed that Whitney, sitting across the room at the time, checked her own phone within seconds of Daniel putting his back down. He told me later that it was not any single moment that bothered him, it was the rhythm of it, the way their timing lined up too precisely, too many times, across too many separate occasions, for it to be coincidence. Over the following weeks, Marcus began paying closer attention without ever making it obvious, because he told me he did not want to accuse anyone of anything based on a feeling alone. He started noticing that whenever I mentioned Whitney was traveling for work or visiting family out of state, Daniel would often have an unrelated errand or trip scheduled around the exact same window. sometimes a landscaping job 2 counties over, sometimes a supply run that took an unusually long time. He compared a photo from one of Whitney's trips, a beach photo she had posted with a caption about needing time alone to think, against a work-related hotel reservation Daniel had mentioned to our father weeks earlier. The balcony railing in the background of Whitney's photo matched the balcony style Daniel had shown my father in a picture from his own hotel room, on a trip he told me was strictly business. Marcus did not confront anyone right away. He told me later that the hardest part of those weeks was carrying that suspicion alone, turning it over at night, trying to convince himself he was wrong, because the alternative meant delivering news that would destroy his sister's marriage and possibly the closest friendship I had ever had. He is not a man who enjoys conflict, and he certainly is not a man who enjoys being the reason a family falls apart. But every time he considered staying quiet, he told me, he pictured me finding out on my own, months or years later, and asking him why he never said anything, when he clearly had reason to suspect. He said that question scared him more than any awkward conversation ever could. The moment he finally decided to tell me came after one more piece fell into place, a piece he did not go looking for. Our sister-in-law mentioned, almost in passing during a phone call, that Whitney had asked her for advice about booking a private cabin upstate for what she called a solo retreat. On dates that happened to fall exactly during a week, Daniel had told me he was staying overnight for a landscaping contract 2 hours north. Marcus asked no follow-up questions in that moment. He simply thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat with that information for 2 full days before he called me and asked if he could come by the house alone, without Daniel there, to talk about something important. I remember that afternoon clearly because Marcus is not a man who asks to talk about something important very often. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where, months later, an entirely different and far more painful conversation would take place with our mother. He told me everything slowly, carefully, laying out each piece of what he had noticed without exaggeration and without accusing anyone of anything he could not support. He said he was not certain, that he could be wrong, but that he could not in good conscience stay quiet any longer and let me continue believing something that might not be true. I sat there listening to my older brother, a man who almost never raises his voice or his suspicions about anyone, calmly explain to me that my husband and my best friend might be having an affair, and something in his tone told me he already believed it far more than he was letting on. I did not cry in that moment, not right away. I remember feeling strangely calm, almost numb, the way I imagine people describe the seconds right after an accident, before the pain actually arrives. I asked Marcus question after question, trying to find a hole in what he had told me, trying to find the innocent explanation that would let me keep believing in the life I had built. He answered every question patiently, and every answer only made the picture clearer instead of offering me the escape I was looking for. Before he left that evening, he told me one more thing, something I have held on to every single day since. He said, "I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you because you deserve to know the truth, whatever it costs me." What it would eventually cost him, none of us could have predicted that night. I had no idea, sitting at that kitchen table with my brother, that the hardest part of this entire ordeal was not going to be confirming the affair itself, painful as that would be. The hardest part was going to come weeks later, in my mother's kitchen, when the one person I expected to stand beside me without question chose, instead, to stand somewhere else entirely. After Marcus left my house that night, I did not sleep. I lay awake replaying every small detail he had shared with me, trying to decide how I would even begin confronting Daniel without giving away everything my brother had risked to tell me. By morning, I had decided I could not simply confront him directly, not yet. I needed something undeniable first, something he could not talk his way around the way I knew, after 11 years of marriage, he was fully capable of doing. So instead, I waited 3 days, watching him more closely than I ever had before, noticing things I had somehow trained myself not to notice for months, maybe longer. The confirmation came sooner than I expected, and it came from Daniel himself, though not in the way anyone would choose. He left his laptop open on the kitchen counter one evening while he showered, something he almost never did, and a message notification appeared on the screen from an account name I did not recognize at first. When I opened it, out of a mixture of dread and something close to desperation, I found an entire conversation thread between him and Whitney that stretched back over a year, filled with the kind of language that left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. There were plans mentioned for future trips. There were apologies for having to sneak around. There was, near the bottom of the thread, a message from Whitney that read simply, "I hate lying to her, but I don't know how to stop now." Reading her words hurt almost as much as reading his. I confronted Daniel that same night, the moment he came out of the shower, laptop still open on the table between us. I remember his face when he saw what I was looking at, a mixture of panic and something almost like relief, as though part of him had been waiting to be caught for a long time. He did not deny it outright at first. He tried, briefly, to claim the conversation was old, that it had ended months ago, that I was misunderstanding the context. I let him talk for exactly as long as it took me to find one more message, dated 4 days earlier, confirming plans to meet at Whitney's cousin's cabin the following weekend. After that, he stopped pretending. Over the next several days, the full timeline came out in painful pieces, mostly through Daniel, though a few details later came from Whitney herself, when I finally forced a conversation with her too. The affair had started just over a year earlier, following what Whitney described as a difficult period in her own life. A breakup, she said, left her feeling isolated, and Daniel described as simply being there for a friend who needed support. What began as long phone calls late at night, according to both of them, slowly became something else entirely, something they both claimed they never intended, and both continued anyway, month after month, dinner after dinner, holiday after holiday, sitting across from me at my own table. What hurt almost as much as the affair itself was learning who else had known, or at least suspected, and said nothing. A mutual friend admitted, once everything was already out in the open, that she had seen Daniel and Whitney together at a restaurant across town months earlier, and assumed it was simply a work-related meeting, not wanting to embarrass herself by asking questions that were not her business. My sister-in-law, the same woman who unknowingly gave Marcus the final piece of the puzzle, told me she had noticed Whitney seeming distant and evasive for months, but chalked it up to personal stress, never once suspecting the real reason. Nobody in that circle had lied to protect the affair directly. They had simply looked away, the way people often do when the truth in front of them is inconvenient. Telling my mother felt, at the time, like the one part of this entire ordeal that would not require bracing myself. I called her 2 days after confronting Daniel, still raw, still barely holding myself together, and asked if I could come by that afternoon. I remember sitting in my car outside her house for several minutes before going inside, rehearsing how I would say it, preparing myself for her to be angry on my behalf, to hold me the way she had when I was a teenager and my first serious boyfriend broke my heart. I expected her fury to be aimed squarely at Daniel. I did not expect, even for a moment, that it would end up aimed anywhere else. I told her everything at her kitchen table, the same kind of table where, weeks earlier, Marcus had told me the truth in my own home. I told her about the messages, the year-long timeline, the cabin, all of it, watching her face carefully for the reaction I had spent the entire drive over preparing myself to receive. What I got instead was silence, longer than I expected, followed by a question that caught me completely off guard. Her first words were not, "Are you okay?" Her first words were, "Are you sure you're not misunderstanding this?" I remember sitting there, stunned, repeating the parts of the story I thought must not have been clear enough the first time, certain that once she fully understood, her reaction would shift into the comfort I was so desperately waiting for. It never came. Instead, over the following 20 minutes, my mother slowly began constructing a version of events that somehow made the entire situation feel smaller, more manageable, more forgivable than what I had actually described to her. She reminded me that Daniel had always been a good provider, a good father to my son, a man who showed up for our family in ways that mattered. She suggested, gently at first and then more directly, that people make mistakes under stress, that Whitney had clearly been struggling emotionally, that perhaps this was something a marriage could recover from with enough time and the right kind of forgiveness. She never once, in that entire conversation, said a single word that sounded like she was on my side. Then came the part of the conversation that changed everything between us permanently. When I mentioned that Marcus was the one who had first noticed something was wrong and brought it to me, my mother's entire demeanor shifted. and not in the direction I expected. Instead of thanking him, instead of acknowledging what it must have cost him to come forward, she grew visibly frustrated, almost angry, and asked why he felt the need to insert himself into my marriage at all. She said that some things are better left alone, that Marcus should have minded his own business, that his interference had caused far more damage than it prevented. I remember staring at her, waiting for her to catch herself, to correct course, to realize what she was actually saying out loud. She never did. I left my mother's house that afternoon more shaken than I had been after confronting Daniel himself, which is something I did not think was possible. On the drive home, I called Marcus and told him what she had said, bracing myself for him to be hurt, to be angry, to demand an apology from her, the way any reasonable person would expect. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, before saying simply, "I figured she might react that way. I just didn't expect it to be that fast." His response told me he had already suspected something about our mother that I had never allowed myself to consider, something that would become painfully clear only a few weeks later, in a conversation that would end our relationship for good. 3 weeks after that first conversation in her kitchen, my mother called and asked me to come by again, saying she wanted to talk things through properly, without emotions running as high as they had been that first afternoon. I went, mostly because some small part of me still hoped she simply needed time to process everything, the way people sometimes do when news is too large to absorb all at once. I sat down at the same table, across from the same chair, and for the first few minutes, the conversation felt almost normal, almost like she had softened. Then she reached across the table, took my hand, and said the sentence that I have replayed in my mind nearly every single day since. She said, "You should have let me handle it my way." I asked her what that meant, and she told me plainly that she had been planning to speak with Daniel privately, to help guide him toward ending things with Whitney quietly, to manage the situation in a way that kept the marriage intact and avoided what she called unnecessary embarrassment for the family. I sat there trying to understand how my own mother could speak about my marriage, my pain, my betrayal, as though it were a public relations problem to be managed, rather than a wound to be healed. I asked her directly whether she understood that Marcus had not caused this situation, that he had simply told me the truth about something that was already happening. Her response is the part of this story I still find hardest to accept. She said that truth is not always kind, and that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is let a situation resolve itself quietly instead of blowing it apart in front of everyone. She was not speaking about Daniel and Whitney's choices in that sentence. She was speaking about my brother's choice to tell me. It took weeks of sitting with that conversation before I finally understood the deeper reason behind my mother's reaction. And the answer, once I found it, explained far more than I expected. Years earlier, long before I was old enough to fully understand what was happening in my own house, my father had an affair of his own, one that lasted almost 2 years before it quietly ended and was never spoken about again in our family. My mother knew. She had known the entire time it was happening, and rather than confront it publicly the way I had just done with Daniel, she chose to manage it privately, to wait it out, to preserve the marriage and the family image at what I can only imagine was enormous personal cost to her. My aunt, my father's own sister, finally told me this during a quiet conversation months after everything with Daniel came apart, admitting she had always assumed I knew, and had no idea I was hearing it for the first time as a grown woman with a marriage of my own, already in ruins. Understanding that history changed how I saw my mother's reaction, though it did not excuse it. She was not simply protecting Daniel out of blind loyalty to a son-in-law she liked. She was protecting a worldview she had built her entire adult life around, the belief that a marriage worth saving is one you quietly endure through, no matter the cost, no matter what it asks you to swallow. When I chose to confront Daniel openly, to let the truth come out completely instead of managing it privately the way she had, I was, without meaning to, holding up a mirror to a choice she had made decades earlier and never fully reckoned with. And when Marcus told me the truth instead of letting it stay buried, he had unknowingly done exactly what she believed deep down she should have done for herself all those years ago and never had the strength to do. Marcus, when I finally shared this with him, listened quietly for a long time before responding, the way he always does. He told me he had suspected something like this for years, Small comments our mother had made over the years about marriage requiring sacrifice, about certain truths being better left unspoken, about women who leave their husbands over affairs being, in her words, too proud to fight for their families. He said he had never fully understood those comments until now, but that they had always sat uneasily with him, even as a teenager. He also told me something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said, "She's not protecting Daniel. She's protecting the story she's told herself about her own marriage for 30 years. You just happened to be standing in the way of it." Sitting in that kitchen that afternoon, listening to my mother explain, almost calmly, that my brother's honesty had been a mistake, I finally understood the full shape of what I was facing. This was never truly about whether Daniel and Whitney's affair was forgivable. This was about whether I was willing to live inside my mother's definition of loyalty, one built on silence, endurance, and the quiet management of other people's betrayals, or whether I was finally going to choose a different definition entirely, one where the truth mattered more than appearances, and where the people who told me that truth were protected instead of blamed. I remember the exact moment I made that decision, sitting across from her, still holding her hand out of old habit, feeling something inside me finally, quietly, close. I did not end things with my mother in a dramatic scene. No raised voices, no slammed doors, nothing that would look the way these moments often look in movies. I simply stood up from her kitchen table, told her I loved her, but that I could not continue a relationship where the truth was treated as a threat, and the people who spoke it were treated as the enemy. She asked me not to leave things that way, told me I was being emotional, told me I would regret cutting her off once things calmed down. I remember pausing at her front door, looking back at her one last time, and telling her that I hoped, one day, she would understand why silence was never actually protecting anyone, least of all herself. Then I left, and in the 14 months since, we have not spoken again. Daniel and I finalized our divorce roughly 5 months after that final conversation with my mother. He did not fight me on much, whether out of guilt or exhaustion, I am still not entirely sure, and he agreed to a custody arrangement that kept our son's routine as stable as possible, given everything that had happened around him. Whitney moved out of state not long after, taking a job offer she had apparently been considering for a while, though I have always wondered how much of that decision was about the job, and how much was about no longer being able to face the people who once considered her family. I have not spoken to her since the week I confirmed the affair, and I do not expect that to ever change. What I did not expect, in the months following all of this, was the way the rest of my extended family would react once the full story became known among them. Several relatives who had always seemed close to my mother began quietly distancing themselves from her as well, not out of loyalty to me specifically, but because learning about my father's affair and the decades of silence around it forced several people in our family to re-examine moments from their own past they had never fully understood. My aunt admitted she had wondered for years why my mother seemed to discourage any conversation about marriages ending, even other people's marriages that had nothing to do with her. Suddenly, an old pattern that nobody had ever named out loud finally had an explanation. The most unexpected turn of all came almost a year after everything happened, when my mother reached out through my aunt, asking if I would be willing to talk, saying she had been reflecting on things and wanted to explain herself properly. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and mostly because some part of me still hoped, even after everything, that there might be a version of this conversation that finally gave me what I needed. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, explaining her own history with my father, explaining the pressures she felt as a young wife decades earlier, explaining why she believed what she believed about marriage and loyalty. It was, in many ways, the most honest conversation we had ever had, but not once in those 20 minutes did she say the words I was actually waiting to hear. She never said she was wrong to blame Marcus. She never said she was sorry for choosing Daniel's comfort over my pain. She explained herself thoroughly, but she never apologized, and by the end of that conversation, I understood that she likely never would, not because she did not love me, but because admitting she was wrong about this would mean admitting she had been wrong about her own marriage for 30 years, and that was a truth she was still not ready to face. Marcus, through all of this, never once asked me to choose him over our mother, and never once brought up what it cost him personally to be the one who told me the truth. When I asked him, Months later, whether he regretted saying anything at all, given everything it caused, he said something I think about often. He told me, "I'd rather you be angry at me for telling you the truth than grateful to me for staying quiet while you lived a lie." That single sentence, more than anything my mother ever said to me, is the reason I trust my brother with absolutely everything now, without hesitation, without the smallest doubt. Looking back on all of this now, 14 months removed from that final conversation in my mother's kitchen, I no longer see this as a story only about a husband's affair, though that betrayal certainly started everything. I see it now as a story about the different ways people define loyalty, and how sometimes the people who love you the most are not the ones who protect your comfort, but the ones who are willing to risk your anger in order to give you the truth. My mother believed, and I think genuinely still believes, that she was protecting our family by managing the situation quietly. My brother believed that protecting me meant telling me the truth, even when it cost him something significant to do so. Only one of those definitions actually left me stronger on the other side of it, and I know now, without any doubt, which one that was. So I will leave you with the same question I have asked myself almost every day for the past 14 months. If someone you loved chose to protect someone else's comfort over your pain, and never once acknowledged they were wrong for doing it, would you have stayed in that relationship, hoping things might eventually change? Or would you have done exactly what I did and walked away for good? I share this story not because I want sympathy, but because I know I am not the only person watching this who has had to choose between keeping a peaceful relationship with a parent and finally telling the truth about how that parent has treated them. If you have ever been in a position where someone you loved chose someone else's comfort over your pain and never once acknowledged they were wrong, I would genuinely like to know what you did. Did you stay and keep trying, hoping time would eventually change things, or did you walk away the way I did and never look back? Tell me in the comments, because I promise you, I read every single one, and I think a lot of people watching this right now need to hear that they are not alone in this. If this story affected you the way I hope it did, know that it is far from the only one like it that I plan to share. In an upcoming video, I will be telling you about a woman whose mother-in-law waited until the actual morning of her wedding to reveal a secret that changed everything about that day, and about the marriage that followed it. If stories about family, loyalty, and the hard choices that come after betrayal mean something to you, this channel is exactly where you want to be. So make sure you are subscribed and that your notifications are turned on, because I do not want you to miss what is coming next. Before you go, I want to leave you with the sentence that started this entire story for me. My mother once told me, "You should have let me handle it my way." For a long time, those words made me question myself, made me wonder if I had somehow made a mistake by choosing honesty over her version of peace. I do not wonder that anymore. I am glad I did not let her handle it her way. I am glad my brother told me the truth, no matter what it cost him, and I am glad that, even after losing a husband, a best friend, and a mother within the same 6 months, I know exactly who I can trust with everything that matters most to me now. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and I will see you in the next one.